The roaring sound of motorcycles echoed through the quiet harbor as a group of bikers surrounded a young woman standing by her father's fishing boat. Her trembling hands clutched the edge of the wooden dock, her wide eyes darting between the towering figures. They jeered at her, their laughter sharp and cruel. "What's the matter, princess? Daddy not here to save you?" One of them sneered, his hand gripping the handlebar of his black motorcycle. The leader of the pack, a burly man with a jagged scar across his cheek, leaned in closer. "Or maybe you think you're too good for us?" he growled, his voice dripping with menace. The girl tried to back away, but the dock's edge left her nowhere to go. One of the bikers reached for her arm, his tattooed hand rough against her skin. Before anyone could blink, a deep, commanding voice boomed from the shadows. "Get your hands off my daughter." The bikers froze, their smirks fading as a tall figure emerged from behind a stack of fishing crates. Dressed in a worn navy sweatshirt and jeans, he looked like an ordinary fisherman. Until you saw in his eyes. They were cold, calculating, and filled with a deadly calm. One of the bikers laughed nervously. "What's this? Her old man thinks he can take us on." The man stepped forward, his presence as unyielding as the tide. "You're about to find out," he said, his voice low and steady. What happened next would haunt the bikers forever. It all began earlier that morning when Emily, a bright and determined teenager, decided to visit the docks to help her dad prepare for the day's fishing trip. The harbor was a place she loved, with its salty breeze and the gentle creak of boats swaying on the water. Her father, Joe Matthews, was well known in the small coastal town. To most, he was just a humble fisherman with a strong work ethic and a kind heart. But Emily knew there was more to him. Joe had a past he rarely spoke about, a life he had left behind when Emily was born. He'd served in the Navy SEALs for over a decade, his skills honed in some of the most dangerous missions around the world. When he retired, he chose a quiet life, far from the chaos. Emily only learned bits and pieces of his past through overheard conversations and old photos tucked away in a dusty box. That day, as Emily loaded a crate of bait onto the boat, she noticed the gang of bikers idling near the parking lot. She didn't think much of them at first. Crews like that often stopped by the docks on their way through town. But as the morning stretched on, their behavior grew unsettling. They whistled at her when she walked past, their comments growing louder and cruder. Emily did her best to ignore them, focusing on her tasks. Joe had gone to the market to pick up supplies, leaving Emily alone for what she thought would only be a few minutes. But the bikers took advantage of her isolation. "Hey, sweetheart," one of them called out, leaning against his bike. "How about you show us around?" Emily stiffened, her heart racing. She avoided eye contact and kept walking, hoping they would lose interest. Instead, they'd followed her to the dock. "Don't be rude," another said with a mocking grin. "We're just trying to be friendly." Emily's hands shook as she fumbled with a rope, pretending not to hear them. The leader of the group, a man everyone seemed to obey without question, stepped closer. His presence was suffocating, his voice a low rumble. "You think you're too good to talk to us?" he asked, his tone dangerous. Emily swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. "Please leave me alone." The leader laughed, a sound that sent chills down her spine. "Not until we've had some fun." That's when they cornered her, cutting off any escape. Emily's mind raced, desperate for a way out. She wished her dad were there. He'd always been her protector, her rock. But he wasn't coming back for at least another hour, or so she thought. The bikers didn't notice Joe watching from a distance. He'd returned early from the market and saw the group circling his daughter. The sight made his blood boil, but years of training kept him calm. He analyzed the situation, noting each man's position, their body language, and the potential threats they posed. Joe approached silently, staying out of sight until he was close enough to intervene. When he finally spoke, his voice cut through the chaos like a knife. "Get your hands off my daughter," he repeated, stepping onto the dock. The bikers turned to face him, their bravado faltering as they saw the look in his eyes. But they didn't know who they were dealing with. Not yet. Joe's hand clenched into a fist as the leader of the group smirked and said, "What are you gonna do about it, old man?" Joe didn't respond immediately. He didn't have to. His cold stare said enough. Emily stood frozen, torn between fear and the odd sense of reassurance her dad's presence brought. The tension on the dock was thick, the sound of waves and distant seagulls drowned out by the heavy silence. The leader, emboldened by the perceived numbers advantage, laughed again. "You think you scare us? We've dealt with tougher than you." Joe tilted his head slightly, his lips forming a thin line. His calm wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a storm waiting to break. "You've made a mistake today," he said, his voice steady. The leader shrugged, gesturing to his group. "We'll see about that." One of the bikers, eager to impress, lunged forward. Joe moved faster than anyone could process. With a single fluid motion, he sidestepped the attack, grabbed the man's wrist, and twisted it. The biker cried out in pain as he dropped to his knees. Joe let him go, and the man crumpled onto the dock, clutching his arm. The remaining bikers hesitated, stunned by what they'd just seen. The leader barked, "What are you waiting for? Get him." Two bikers charged at Joe simultaneously. Emily screamed, but her dad didn't flinch. His training kicked in, muscle memory taking over. He ducked under one attacker's wild swing and delivered a swift punch to his gut, knocking the wind out of him. The second biker tried to grab Joe from behind, but Joe spun around and struck him with a precise elbow to the chest, sending him staggering backward. Emily watched in awe and terror as her dad dismantled the group. He wasn't just defending her. He was teaching them a lesson. Every movement was calculated, every strike deliberate. He wasn't fighting recklessly. He was in complete control. The leader, now visibly nervous, stepped back as his remaining men hesitated. "What the hell are you?" he muttered, his voice shaky. Joe took a step forward, his gaze locked on the leader. "The man who's about to end this," he said, his tone chilling. Before the leader could respond, the sound of a police siren echoed in the distance. Someone at the harbor must have called the cops. The bikers exchanged panicked glances. They knew their time was up. "You got lucky," the leader snarled, backing away toward his motorcycle. "This isn't over." Joe didn't reply. He simply watched as the bikers scrambled onto their bikes and roared away, their bravado replaced by fear. Emily rushed to her dad's side, tears streaming down her face. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling. What just happened? How did you do all that?" Joe placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll talk about it later," he said softly, his voice losing its edge. "Let's get you home." The drive back to their house was quiet. Emily couldn't stop replaying the scene in her head. Her dad had always been strong and protective, but this was something else entirely. She'd never seen him like that, so composed, so dangerous. Questions swirled in her mind, but she didn't know where to start. When they got home, Joe went straight to the kitchen and began making tea, as if nothing had happened. Emily sat at the table, her hands fidgeting. Finally, she worked up the courage to speak. "Dad, who are you?" Joe paused, his back to her. He took a deep breath before turning around, his expression unreadable. "I'm your father," he said simply. "That's not what I mean," Emily pressed. "Those men, you fought them like you've done it 1,000 times before. How do you know how to do all that?" Joe sat down across from her, his shoulders heavy. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then, in a quiet voice, he began, "Before you were born, I wasn't just a fisherman. I worked for the Navy. I was part of a special unit." Emily's eyes widened. "Special unit? Like the SEALs?" Joe nodded. "That's right. I spent years training and serving in missions most people never hear about. But when your mom and I had you, I realized I didn't want that life anymore. I wanted to be here for you, to raise you in a safe place." Emily's mind raced. It all made sense now, the photos he kept hidden, the scars he never explained, the way he seemed to always know what to do in any situation. But it also raised more questions. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" she asked. Joe gave her a sad smile. "Because I wanted you to see me as your dad, not as whatever I was back then. That part of my life is over. At least it was supposed to be. Before Emily could respond, a knock at the door interrupted them. Joe's face hardened instantly. He stood, motioning for Emily to stay put. Peering through the window, he relaxed slightly and opened the door. Sheriff Carter, a family friend, stood on the porch, his face serious. "Joe," the sheriff began, "we need to talk." The sheriff stepped inside, removing his hat as he glanced at Emily. "I heard what happened at the docks. You all right, kiddo?" Emily nodded, but the sheriff's presence only heightened her unease. "I'm okay." Sheriff Carter turned to Joe. "Those bikers, they're part of a gang that's been causing trouble up and down the coast. Petty theft, intimidation, sometimes worse. They've been laying low in the next town over, but it looks like they're expanding their turf." Joe crossed his arms. "So what are you doing about it?" "We're keeping an eye on them, but they're slippery," the sheriff admitted. "I just wanted to warn you. They don't take kindly to being embarrassed. And from what I heard, you gave them a good reason to hold a grudge." Joe's jaw tightened. "If they come back, I'll be ready." Sheriff Carter hesitated. "Joe, these guys are dangerous. Be careful." Joe nodded, and the sheriff left, leaving an uneasy silence in his wake. Emily looked at her dad, fear creeping into her voice. "Do you think they'll come back?" Joe's expression was unreadable, but his voice was firm. "If they do, they'll regret it." That night, as Emily lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Her dad might have scared the bikers off for now, but something told her they weren't the kind of people to let things go. And as much as she trusted her dad's strength and skill, she couldn't help but worry. In the distance, the faint sound of motorcycles echoed through the night, growing louder. The rumble of motorcycles shattered the stillness of the night, their engines growing louder as they neared the small Matthews home. Emily sat up in bed, her heart pounding. She threw off the blanket and hurried to the window, peering through the blinds. Her worst fears were confirmed. A line of headlights snaked down the dirt road leading to their house. "Dad," she called out, her voice trembling. Joe was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table, sharpening a fillet knife. He had heard the engines long before Emily and knew this moment was coming. As Emily burst into the room, panic written across her face, he stood and placed the knife down. "Stay in your room," he said calmly, his voice steady but firm. "What?" "No," Emily protested. "You can't take them on alone." Joe crouched down, placing his hands on her shoulders. "Listen to me, Emily. I need you to trust me. Lock your door, stay quiet, and don't come out until I tell you it's safe." "But," she began, tears welling in her eyes. "No buts," Joe interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Go. Now." Reluctantly, Emily obeyed, retreating to her room and locking the door behind her. She crouched by the window, her breath shallow as she watched the scene unfold. Joe stepped out onto the porch, his boots creaking against the wooden planks. The headlights of the motorcycles cast long, eerie shadows across the yard. The leader of the gang, the scar-faced man from earlier, dismounted his bike and walked toward the house, flanked by two of his men. The rest of the gang stayed back, their engines idling like a pack of growling wolves. Well, the leader sneered, stopping a few feet from the porch steps. "Looks like the fisherman's got some fight in him after all." Joe leaned against the porch railing, his expression calm but his eyes watchful. "You boys are lost," he said. "The road back to town is that way." The leader chuckled, a low, menacing sound. "You embarrassed us today. Made us look weak in front of the whole town. We can't let that slide." Joe's grip on the railing tightened, but his face remained impassive. "You don't want to do this." The leader's smirk widened. "Oh, I think we do." He signaled to his men, and the gang began to spread out, surrounding the house. Joe glanced at the shadows moving in the yard, counting each figure. 10, maybe 12 of them. More than enough to make things interesting. But he wasn't worried. Not yet. "You had your chance to walk away," Joe said, his voice carrying an edge of finality. The leader sneered. "And you had your chance to keep your head down," Too late for that now. He gave another signal, and two of the bikers rushed the porch. Joe moved like lightning. He grabbed the fillet knife from his belt and swung it in a tight arc, slashing the first biker's arm and forcing him to drop the crowbar he was holding. Before the second biker could react, Joe delivered a swift kick to his knee, sending him sprawling to the ground. The gang froze, momentarily stunned by the speed and precision of Joe's movements. The leader growled in frustration. "Get him." Inside the house, Emily listened in horror as the sounds of a fight erupted outside. Shouts, the crunch of boots on gravel, and the unmistakable sound of something heavy hitting the ground filled the air. She pressed her hands over her ears, trying to block it out, but it was no use. Her dad was out there, fighting for both of their lives, and there was nothing she could do to help. Her gaze fell on her cell phone lying on the nightstand. She grabbed it, her fingers trembling as she dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? The operator answered. There's a gang at our house, Emily whispered, her voice shaking. They're trying to hurt my dad. Please send help. The operator's calm voice reassured her. Help is on the way. Stay on the line with me. Emily nodded, clutching the phone like a lifeline. Hurry, she begged. Please hurry. Outside, the fight raged on. Joe was a blur of movement, dodging blows and delivering calculated strikes that left his attackers groaning on the ground. He fought with the efficiency of a man who had spent years mastering the art of survival. But even he knew his limits. He couldn't hold them all forever. The leader, sensing an opportunity, pulled a knife from his boot and lunged at Joe. Joe sidestepped the attack, but the leader was quicker than the others, and the blade grazed his arm. Joe hissed in pain but didn't let it slow him down. He countered with a sharp elbow to the leader's jaw, sending him stumbling backward. Is that all you've got? The leader taunted, wiping blood from his lip. You're good, old man, but you're not invincible. Joe didn't respond. He was already calculating his next move, scanning the yard for anything he could use to even the odds. His eyes landed on a length of heavy chain coiled near the porch steps. With a quick motion, he grabbed it and swung it in a wide arc, forcing the bikers to back off. The distant sound of sirens reached Joe's ears, growing louder by the second. The gang heard it too, their bravado faltering as they realized the police were closing in. This isn't over, the leader shouted, his voice laced with frustration and fury. He gestured to his men, and they retreated to their bikes, revving their engines angrily. One by one, they roared off into the night, leaving behind their injured comrades who couldn't ride. Joe stood on the porch, his chest heaving as he watched them disappear into the darkness. Blood dripped from the cut on his arm, but he didn't seem to notice. He turned and walked back into the house, his face grim. Emily was waiting for him in the kitchen, her phone still in her hand. Tears streamed down her face as she ran to him. Dad, you're hurt. Joe shook his head. It's just a scratch. Are you okay? Emily nodded, throwing her arms around him. I was so scared. I thought they were going to. They're gone, Joe interrupted, his voice softening. And they won't come back. Not tonight. As the sound of approaching police cars filled the air, Emily clung to her dad, relief washing over her. But deep down she knew this wasn't over. The gang wasn't the type to forgive and forget, and sooner or later, they would come back. And when they did, she and her dad would have to be ready. The flashing blue and red lights illuminated the front yard as several police cars skidded to a stop outside the Matthews home. Officers spilled out, weapons drawn, ready for a confrontation. Sheriff Carter was among them, his face set in a grim expression. Joe stepped onto the porch, raising his hands to show he wasn't a threat. It's over, he called out. They're gone. Sheriff Carter signaled for the officers to lower their weapons. He approached Joe, his sharp eyes scanning the scene. The yard was littered with signs of the fight, scattered debris, overturned chairs, and the groaning bodies of two injured bikers who hadn't escaped with the others. What the hell happened here, Joe? The sheriff asked, his voice low. Joe leaned against the railing, his face calm despite the chaos. They came looking for trouble. I made sure they'd found it." Carter sighed, gesturing for his deputies to secure the scene. "You know this is going to escalate, don't you? These guys don't just walk away." Joe nodded. "I figured as much." The sheriff's gaze shifted to Joe's arm, where blood soaked through his sleeve. "You need to get that looked at." "I'll be fine," Joe replied. "What about them?" He gestured to the injured bikers. Carter grimaced. "We'll take them in, get them patched up, and see what we can learn." "But Joe, I've got to be honest with you. This gang's got a reputation. They're not going to let this go." Joe's jaw tightened. "Let them come. I'm not scared." The sheriff hesitated, then lowered his voice. "I know what you used to do, Joe. But this isn't a war zone anymore. You've got Emily to think about." Joe's expression softened at the mention of his daughter. "That's exactly why I'm not backing down." Inside the house, Emily sat on the couch, her hands still trembling as she tried to process everything. The adrenaline was fading, leaving her drained and scared. She jumped when the front door opened, and her dad walked in, followed by Sheriff Carter. "Emily," the sheriff said gently, his hat in his hands. "You did the right thing calling 911. You're a brave kid." She forced a small smile, but her voice was barely a whisper. "I was so scared." Joe knelt in front of her, placing a reassuring hand on her knee. "You don't have to be scared anymore," he said. "I won't let anything happen to you." "But what if they come back?" she asked, her voice trembling. "They're not just going to forget this." Joe exchanged a look with the sheriff, who sighed. "We're going to do everything we can to keep you safe," Carter said. "I'll have patrols swing by your house regularly, and we'll make sure these guys know we're watching." Emily nodded, but the fear in her eyes didn't fade. Joe could see it, and it tore at him. He'd spent his entire life protecting others, but this was different. This was personal. The next few days passed uneventfully, but the tension lingered. Joe repaired the damage to the yard and reinforced the locks on the doors and windows. He didn't tell Emily, but he also set up a few improvised security measures, pressure-triggered alarms and hidden traps he'd learned to make during his time in the SEALs. Emily tried to return to her normal routine, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time she heard a motorcycle engine, her stomach dropped, and she found herself glancing over her shoulder more often than she liked. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily sat on the porch, staring out at the quiet road. Her dad joined her, carrying 2 mugs of hot chocolate. He handed her one and sat down beside her. "You okay?" he asked. She shrugged, wrapping her hands around the mug. "I don't know, I just feel different. Like I'm always waiting for something bad to happen." Joe nodded slowly. "That's normal after what you've been through. But you're stronger than you think, Emily. You've always been strong." Emily looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. "How did you do it, Dad? In the Navy, I mean. How did you stay so calm when everything around you was like that?" Joe smiled faintly. "It wasn't always easy, but I learned to focus on what mattered most, staying alive, protecting my team, and getting through one moment at a time. You do the same thing now. You focus on what matters." Emily nodded, but her father's words didn't erase her lingering fears. She sipped her hot chocolate, trying to push the thoughts away. Later that night, Joe was finishing up some paperwork in the kitchen when he heard a faint noise outside. His instincts kicked in immediately. He turned off the kitchen light, plunging the room into darkness, and moved to the window. Peering through the blinds, he scanned the yard. At first, he saw nothing. Then, in the faint glow of the moonlight, he noticed movement near the tree line. Shadows shifted, and Joe's sharp eyes caught the glint of metal. Someone was out there. His pulse quickened, but he stayed calm. Quietly, he retrieved the shotgun he kept hidden in the pantry and moved to Emily's room. She was sound asleep, her breathing steady. He gently shook her awake. "Emily," he whispered, "wake up." She stirred, blinking groggily. "Dad, what's wrong?" "Stay quiet," he said. "I need you to hide in the closet. Don't come out until I tell you." Her eyes widened, fear replacing sleep. "Are they back?" I don't know, he admitted. But I'm going to find out. Go. Now. Emily didn't argue this time. She climbed out of bed and slipped into the closet, pulling the door shut behind her. Joe waited until he was sure she was safe before heading back to the living room. The shadows in the yard moved closer, and Joe's grip on the shotgun tightened. He positioned himself near the front door, his body tense but his mind clear. Whoever was out there had made a grave mistake. Suddenly, a loud crash shattered the silence. Someone had broken a window on the side of the house. Joe moved quickly, his training taking over. He crouched low, his senses on high alert, as he waited for the intruders to make their next move. The sound of breaking glass was followed by silence, the kind that made Joe's skin prickle. He steadied his breathing, crouched low in the shadows of the living room. His grip on the shotgun was firm but not rigid. Muscle memory kept him ready to act without hesitation. The faint crunch of footsteps on broken glass reached his ears. Someone was inside the house. Joe didn't need to see them to know there was more than one. He could feel the movement, the shifts in weight, the subtle sounds most people would overlook. From her hiding spot in the closet, Emily clutched her knees to her chest. She pressed her hands over her mouth, trying to muffle her ragged breathing. Her heart pounded so hard she feared it would give her away. Every sound outside the closet, every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of movement, felt magnified like a thunderstorm in her ears. Joe positioned himself behind the doorframe of a living room, staying out of sight, but within striking range. The intruders were methodical, moving slowly through the house. He could hear them murmuring to each other, their voices low but tense. "Check the kitchen," one voice hissed. "Make sure he's alone." Another voice responded, but Joe couldn't make out the words. He didn't need to. He knew they were looking for him, and possibly Emily. One of the intruders stepped into the living room, his silhouette visible in the faint light streaming through the windows. Joe's muscles coiled like a spring. The man carried a crowbar, his movements cautious but determined. He didn't see Joe in the shadows, and that was his first mistake. With a quick, fluid motion, Joe struck. He lunged forward, the butt of the shotgun slamming into the man's ribs. The intruder let out a strangled cry, dropping the crowbar as he crumpled to the ground. Before he could recover, Joe pressed the barrel of the shotgun to his chest. "Who sent you?" Joe demanded, his voice low and dangerous. The man groaned, clutching his side. "Screw you," he spat. Joe's jaw tightened. Wrong answer. A second figure appeared in the doorway, this one holding a knife. He froze when he saw Joe standing over his companion, the shotgun aimed and ready. Joe didn't give him a chance to act. He shifted his aim, firing a warning shot into the floorboards. The deafening blast echoed through the house, and the man with the knife dropped it, raising his hands in surrender. "All right. All right." The second intruder stammered. "We were just sent to scare you, if that's all." "Who sent you?" Joe repeated, his voice like ice. The man hesitated, glancing nervously at his fallen companion. It was Zeke. The boss wanted to send a message. Joe's eyes narrowed. Zeke, the scar-faced leader of the bikers. He had expected retaliation, but the timing surprised him. Zeke wasn't just sending a message. He was testing Joe's defenses. "What was the message?" Joe asked. The man swallowed hard. "He said you should have stayed out of it. Said this was just the beginning." Joe's grip on the shotgun tightened. He stepped back, gesturing with the barrel. "Get your friend and get out of my house." The man didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled to help his companion to his feet, both of them stumbling toward the broken window. Joe followed, his shotgun trained on them until they disappeared into the darkness. When the house was silent again, Joe locked the doors and windows, checking each one twice. He returned to Emily's room, opening the closet door slowly. Emily flinched, her wide eyes staring up at him. "It's me," Joe said gently, lowering the shotgun. Emily hesitated, then launched herself into his arms, sobbing. "I heard it all," she whispered. I thought they were going to hurt you." Joe held her tightly, his voice steady. They didn't. And they won't. Not as long as I'm here. She pulled back slightly, looking up at him. Who sent them? Zeke, Joe admitted, the leader of the gang from the docks. Emily's fear turned to anger. Why won't they leave us alone? We didn't do anything to them. Joe sighed, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Sometimes people like them don't need a reason. They see anyone standing up to them as a threat. So what do we do? She asked, her voice trembling. Joe's expression hardened. We prepare. The next morning, Joe made a series of calls. First, he reached out to Sheriff Carter, informing him of the break-in and giving him a detailed description of the intruders. Carter promised to increase patrols around the house and keep an eye on the gang's movements, but even he sounded uneasy. Joe, this isn't going to end with a couple of patrol cars, the sheriff warned. If Zeke wants a war, he'll bring one. Then I'll be ready, Joe replied. His second call was to an old Navy buddy, Mark Collins, who lived a few hours away. Mark had retired from the SEALs around the same time as Joe and ran a private security firm. He owed Joe a favor or several. Mark, Joe began, his tone serious. I need your help. By midday, Mark arrived at the Matthews house, his truck loaded with equipment. He was a gruff, no-nonsense man with a sharp mind and a dry sense of humor. The two men greeted each other with a firm handshake. Long time, Joe, Mark said, glancing around. This the quiet life you traded in for? Was quiet until recently, Joe replied. He filled Mark in on everything that had happened, from the docks to the break-in. Mark listened carefully, his expression growing darker. You're dealing with amateurs, Mark said finally. Dangerous amateurs, but amateurs nonetheless. They'll keep coming unless you make it clear they're outmatched. Joe nodded. That's why I called you. Mark smirked. Let's get to work. Over the next few hours, the two men transformed the Matthews home into a fortress. Mark brought in motion sensors, reinforced locks, and even a set of surveillance cameras. Joe worked alongside him, setting up improvised defenses in the yard and mapping out escape routes. Emily watched them from a distance, a mix of awe and apprehension in her eyes. For the first time, she realized just how much her dad's past had prepared him for situations like this. But it also scared her. She didn't want their home to become a battleground. As the sun set, Joe and Mark sat on the porch, surveying their work. The house was as secure as they could make it, but both men knew it wouldn't stop Zeke forever. This isn't over, Mark said, voicing what Joe already knew. No, Joe agreed, his gaze fixed on the horizon. But it will be. The night was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made every creak of the house and every rustle of leaves sound louder than it should. Emily lay awake in her room, staring at the ceiling, the events of the past days replaying in her mind. Her father and Mark had turned their home into a fortress, but it still didn't feel like enough. She couldn't shake the fear that the bikers would come back, stronger, angrier, and more prepared. In the living room, Joe and Mark sat at the table, reviewing the layout of the property. A map of the surrounding area was spread out between them, marked with potential entry points and escape routes. You think they'll come tonight? Mark asked, his voice low. Joe nodded slowly. It's what I would do. Strike while we're still on edge, while Emily's still scared. They want to rattle us. Mark leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. They don't know what they're up against. That's your edge. Use it. Joe's lips curved into a faint smile. Oh, I plan to. Just past midnight, Emily's restless sleep was interrupted by a faint noise outside her window. Her eyes flew open, her body tense. She sat up slowly, listening. At first, she thought it might be the wind, but then she heard it again. A low, mechanical whirring like the sound of a motorcycle engine idling in the distance. Heart pounding, she climbed out of bed and crept to the window. Peeking through the curtains, she saw headlights in the distance, just beyond the tree line. She counted at least 6 bikes, their engines growling softly as the riders dismounted. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She turned and rushed to the living room, where her dad and Mark were already on their feet. Joe was holding his shotgun, and Mark had a handgun holstered at his side. "They're here," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Joe nodded, his face calm but his eyes sharp. "Get to the safe room, Emily. You know the drill." Emily hesitated, her gaze flickering between her dad and Mark. "What about you?" "We'll handle it," Joe said firmly. "Now go." Reluctantly, Emily obeyed. She hurried to the small pantry that Joe and Mark had converted into a safe room, complete with reinforced walls and a heavy steel door. She locked herself inside, her heart racing as she pressed her ear to the door. Joe and Mark positioned themselves near the front windows, watching as the bikers approached the house. Zeke was at the front of the group, his scarred face twisted into a malicious grin. He held a bat slung over one shoulder, while the others carried a mix of weapons, chains, pipes, and even a few knives. "Subtle," Mark muttered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Joe didn't respond. His focus was on Zeke, studying the man's movements, looking for any sign of hesitation or weakness. But Zeke showed none. He marched up the driveway with the confidence of someone who thought he had already won. Zeke stopped a few yards from the porch, gesturing for his men to fan out. He raised his voice, shouting, "Hey, old man, we're back. How about you come out and play?" Joe stepped out onto the porch, his shotgun resting casually against his shoulder. Mark stayed inside, his weapon drawn, covering Joe from the shadows. "You should have stayed gone," Joe said, his voice carrying over the still night air. Zeke laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "And miss all the fun? I don't think so. You made this personal, old man. Now we're here to finish it." Joe's eyes narrowed. "You've got one chance to walk away. Take it." Zeke's grin widened. "Or what? You think that little warning shot last time scared us? You're outnumbered. Outgunned. This is over." Joe's expression didn't change. "It's over when I say it is." Zeke raised his bat, signaling his men to charge. They surged forward, shouting and swinging their weapons. Joe fired a warning shot into the air, the blast stopping the gang in their tracks for a brief moment. But they quickly recovered, spreading out to surround the house. Mark stepped out from the shadows, his handgun aimed at the nearest biker. "This is your last warning," he called out. "Back off or this gets messy." Zeke sneered. "You think two of you can take all of us?" Joe and Mark didn't answer. They didn't need to. They moved in sync, their years of training evident in every step. Joe took the lead, firing a shot that blasted a hole in the ground at one biker's feet, sending him scrambling backward. Mark covered the rear, taking down another attacker with a swift, precise strike. The bikers hesitated, clearly not expecting this level of resistance. But Zeke barked at them to keep going, his voice filled with fury. "They're just two guys. Take them down." Inside the safe room, Emily huddled in the corner, her hands over her ears to block out the noise. She hated feeling so helpless, knowing her dad was out there risking his life to protect her. Tears stung her eyes as she whispered, "Please be okay. Please." Suddenly, she heard a new sound, a sharp metallic creak, like someone forcing open a window. Her blood ran cold. They were trying to get inside. Emily's mind raced. She remembered the emergency phone her dad had left in the safe room. Grabbing it, she dialed 911, her voice shaking as she spoke to the operator. "They're inside the house," she whispered. "Please, send help. Hurry." Back outside, the fight escalated. Joe and Mark worked as a seamless unit, taking down one biker after another. Joe swung the butt of the shotgun like a club, knocking weapons out of hands and sending attackers sprawling. Mark's movements were just as efficient, each strike designed to disable without hesitation. But they couldn't keep this up forever. The bikers were relentless, and their numbers were taking a toll. Joe's arm throbbed where one of the attackers had managed to land a blow with a chain, and Mark's lip was split from a lucky punch. Zeke, meanwhile, stayed back, watching the chaos with a smug expression. He didn't need to get his hands dirty. Not yet. This was just the beginning. As the police sirens echoed in the distance, Zeke's grin faded. He shouted to his men, "Fall back. We'll finish this another time." The gang retreated, dragging their injured comrades with them. Joe and Mark didn't pursue. They were too focused on catching their breath and assessing the damage. Joe lowered his shotgun, his chest heaving as he turned to Mark. "This isn't over." Mark wiped the blood from his lip, nodding grimly. "Not by a long shot." The house was silent again, but it wasn't the comforting kind of quiet. It was heavy, tense, filled with the weight of what had just happened. Joe and Mark stood on the porch, their bodies aching from the fight, but their minds still sharp. They knew this was only a pause, a temporary lull before Zeke tried again. Joe's first thought was of Emily. He turned and hurried inside, his boots thudding softly against the wooden floor. He tapped lightly on the safe room door. "Emily, it's me. It's safe now." The door creaked open slowly and Emily peeked out, her face pale and streaked with tears. When she saw her dad, she rushed forward, throwing her arms around him. "I heard everything," she whispered, her voice breaking. I thought they were going to kill you." Joe held her tightly, his own voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "I'm okay. We're okay." Mark stepped into the house, wiping his hands on a rag. "The cops should be here any second," he said. "That was too close, Joe." Joe nodded, his expression grim. "They're testing us, pushing to see how far they can go." Mark's gaze shifted to Emily, who was still clinging to her father. "They're not going to stop, are they?" "No," Joe admitted. "Not until we stop them." Minutes later, the flashing lights of police cars illuminated the yard. Sheriff Carter was the first to step out, his face a mix of anger and concern as he approached the house. He stopped at the porch, surveying the damage, the broken windows, the scattered debris, and the bloodstains on the ground. "What the hell happened here?" Carter demanded, his voice sharp. Joe stepped forward, his tone calm but firm. "Zeke and his gang came back. They didn't get far." Carter glanced at Mark, who gave a curt nod. "We held them off," Mark said. "But it's only a matter of time before they try again." Carter ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in his expression. "Joe, I told you this was going to escalate. These guys don't just quit." Joe crossed his arms. "And I told you I'm not backing down." The sheriff sighed, shaking his head. "I'll put out an APE for Zeke and his crew, but you know how slippery they are. It's not like they're going to stick around town after this." Mark stepped forward. "Then we don't wait for them to come back. We take the fight to them." Joe glanced at Mark, a spark of agreement in his eyes. "You have an idea?" Mark smirked. "I always have an idea." The next morning, Mark laid out his plan at the kitchen table, a map of the surrounding area spread out before him. Emily sat nearby, her arms wrapped around her knees as she listened. "We know Zeke and his gang have a hideout somewhere nearby," Mark began. "They're not the type to leave town completely, not when they've got unfinished business." Joe nodded, his eyes fixed on the map. "You think they're still in the next town over?" "Most likely," Mark said. "But we're not going in blind. I've got contacts who can help us pinpoint their location. Once we know where they are, we hit them hard and fast." Emily's eyes widened. "You're going after them. Isn't that dangerous?" Joe turned to her, his expression softening. "Emily, I don't like it either. But we can't keep waiting for them to come to us. It's not safe for any of us." Mark chimed in. "The best defense is a good offense. If we take Zeke out of the equation, the rest of the gang will scatter." Emily hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. She trusted her dad and Mark, but the thought of them walking into danger made her stomach twist. Mark spent the rest of the day making calls, gathering intel from his old network of contacts. By evening, he had what they needed, a lead on a warehouse just outside the next town, where the gang was rumored to gather. Joe and Mark prepared for the mission with the precision of seasoned operators. They loaded a duffel bag with essential gear, non-lethal weapons, zip ties, flashlights, and a first aid kit. Joe insisted on keeping the focus on subduing and disbanding the gang, not causing unnecessary harm. Emily watched them from the doorway, her hands gripping the frame tightly. "What if something goes wrong?" she asked quietly. Joe walked over to her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll be careful," he promised. "And Mark and I have done this kind of thing before. We know what we're doing." Emily nodded, but the worry in her eyes didn't fade. "Just come back okay?" Joe smiled faintly. "Always." That night, under the cover of darkness, Joe and Mark set out for the warehouse. The drive was quiet, the only sound the hum of the truck's engine. Both men were focused, their minds running through every possible scenario. When they arrived, they parked a safe distance away and approached on foot. The warehouse was a dilapidated structure at the edge of an industrial park. Its broken windows and rusted exterior a perfect cover for illegal activities. Mark peered through a pair of binoculars, scanning the area. "2 guards out front," he murmured. "Probably more inside." Joe nodded. "We'll start with the perimeter. Tick them out quietly." The 2 men moved like shadows, their footsteps silent as they approached the warehouse. The first guard never saw them coming. Mark subdued him with a chokehold, lowering him to the ground gently. Joe took out the second guard with a swift strike to the back of the head, catching him before he could make a sound. With the exterior secured, they moved to the main entrance. Joe pressed his ear to the door, listening to the muffled voices inside. "Sounds like at least 6 of them," he whispered. Mark grinned. "Good. Let's make this quick." Inside the warehouse, Zeke lounged in a battered chair, barking orders at his men. He was confident, smug, completely unaware of the storm about to descend on him. That confidence shattered when the door burst open, and Joe and Mark stepped in, weapons raised. "Game's over, Zeke," Joe said, his voice cold and commanding. Zeke shot to his feet, his expression shifting from shock to fury. "You've got some nerve showing up here," he growled. Joe didn't flinch. "You've been harassing my family, threatening my daughter. You made this personal." Zeke's men hesitated, their loyalty faltering as they realized they were outmatched. But Zeke wasn't ready to give up. "You think you can just walk in here and take me down?" Zeke snarled. "This isn't over." Joe's gaze didn't waver. "Yes, it is." The tension inside the warehouse was palpable, the air charged with the threat of violence. Zeke's men exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence visibly shaken by Joe and Mark's sudden appearance. The 2 former Navy SEALs stood firm, their weapons trained and their expressions unyielding. "Put down your weapons," Joe ordered, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "This doesn't have to get worse for you." Zeke sneered, his grip tightening on the bat he always carried. "You're out of your depth, old man. This is our turf. You don't call the shots here." Joe's lips curved into a faint smile, though there was no humor in it. "That's where you're wrong." Before Zeke could respond, Mark moved. He tossed a flashbang grenade toward the center of the room, the device clattering loudly against the concrete floor. "Cover your ears," Mark shouted. The bikers didn't react quickly enough. The grenade detonated with a deafening bang, blinding white light and a piercing noise, throwing Zeke and his men into chaos. They stumbled, covering their ears and shielding their eyes, disoriented. Joe and Mark moved swiftly, using the chaos to their advantage. Joe rushed forward, disarming one of the bikers and shoving him to the ground. Mark grabbed another, twisting his arm behind his back and securing him with a zip tie. Zeke, however, recovered faster than his men. With a roar of anger, he swung his bat wildly at Joe, who dodged just in time. The bat struck a stack of crates, splintering the wood. Joe retaliated with a sharp kick to Zeke's midsection, sending him staggering backward. "You think this scares me?" Zeke spat, his face twisted in fury. "I've fought tougher guys than you." Joe didn't respond. He circled Zeke, his movements controlled, waiting for an opening. Zeke lunged again, swinging the bat with all his strength. This time, Joe caught it mid-swing, his grip like iron. With a quick twist, he yanked it from Zeke's hands and tossed it aside. Zeke barely had time to react before Joe delivered a series of precise blows. A jab to the ribs, a strike to the jaw, and a final kick that sent him crashing to the ground. Zeke groaned, clutching his side as he glared up at Joe. "It's over," Joe said, his voice low and steady. "You're done." Meanwhile, Mark had subdued the last of the bikers, who were now zip-tied and sitting in a haphazard row against the wall. Some groaned in pain. Others sat silently, their gazes fixed on the floor. Zeke struggled to his feet, his body battered but his pride still intact. "You think this changes anything?" he growled. "There's more of us. You can't stop all of us." Joe stepped closer, his towering presence making Zeke shrink back. "You're done terrorizing my family," he said. "And if you come near us again, you won't get a second chance." Zeke's bravado faltered, but he forced a sneer. "You think you're a hero? You're just a washed-up soldier playing house." Joe's expression didn't change, but his voice dropped an octave. "Try me again, and you'll find out exactly how wrong you are." The sound of sirens echoed in the distance, growing louder as they approached. Mark glanced at Joe. "Time to wrap this up." Joe nodded. "Let's make sure they don't go anywhere." The two men worked quickly, securing the bikers and gathering their weapons in a pile far out of reach. By the time the police arrived, the scene was under control. Sheriff Carter stepped into the warehouse, his gaze sweeping over the subdued gang and the two men standing over them. "Looks like you've had fun," Carter said, raising an eyebrow. Joe crossed his arms. "We handled it." Carter motioned for his deputies to start processing the scene. They began cuffing the bikers and reading them their rights, while others collected evidence from the warehouse. Zeke glared at Joe as he was hauled to his feet, but he said nothing this time. Carter turned back to Joe and Mark. "This might hold them for a while, but these guys have friends. It's not over yet." Mark smirked. "We'll be ready." Carter sighed, shaking his head. "You two are something else. Just try not to start a war, okay?" Joe gave a faint smile. "Only if they don't bring one to us." Back at the house, Emily was waiting anxiously by the window when Joe and Mark returned. She ran to the door as they walked in, her relief evident. "Are you okay?" she asked, her eyes scanning them for injuries. Joe smiled and placed a hand on her shoulder. "We're fine. It's over for now." Emily hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her face. "I was so scared. I thought something bad would happen." Joe held her close, his voice gentle. "I promised you I'd come back, and I always keep my promises." Mark leaned against the wall, watching the reunion with a small smile. "Kid, your dad's the toughest man I know. You don't have to worry about him." Emily pulled back, wiping her eyes. "What happens now?" Joe exchanged a look with Mark. "Now we wait and see. But if they try anything again, we'll be ready." That night, as Emily drifted off to sleep for the first time in what felt like days, Joe sat on the porch, staring out at the quiet road. The fight with Zeke had ended, but he knew the battle wasn't over. The gang might be down, but they weren't out. And as long as they posed a threat to his family, he would stay vigilant. Mark joined him, a cup of coffee in hand. "You did good, Joe," he said. "Not many people would have handled it like you did." Joe nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It's not just about me. It's about Emily. I'll do whatever it takes to keep her safe." Mark raised his cup in a silent toast, to keeping the people we love safe. Joe clinked his coffee mug against Mark's. The two men sitting in quiet camaraderie as the stars twinkled above them. The days that followed the takedown of Zeke and his gang felt like a reprieve, but Joe knew better than to let his guard down. The house remained fortified, and Joe stayed vigilant, his eyes constantly scanning for any signs of trouble. Emily tried to settle back into a routine, but the weight of recent events lingered. Mark stayed on as a precaution, his presence both comforting and practical. Together, he and Joe continued to refine their defenses, anticipating every possible angle an attack could come from. But as the days stretched into a week, Emily began to wonder if the danger had truly passed. One evening, Emily and her dad sat at the kitchen table, the remnants of dinner between them. She twirled a fork in her hands, her gaze distant. "Dad," she said quietly, "what if they come back with more people? What if we can't stop them next time?" Joe set down his coffee mug, leaning forward. "Emily, I won't let that happen. I know you're scared, but we're not alone in this. Mark and I have been through worse. We're ready for whatever comes next." Emily nodded, but the fear in her eyes didn't fade. She wasn't just worried about herself. She was worried about her dad. She'd seen the toll this fight was taking on him, and she hated the idea of him being in danger because of her. The next morning, Joe received an unexpected call. Sheriff Carter was on the line, his tone grave. "Joe, we've got a situation." Zeke's gang wasn't just local. They'd got connections to a larger group, and word's gotten out about what you did. Joe's grip on the phone tightened. "What are you saying, Carter?" "I'm saying more of them are coming," the sheriff replied. "We've got intel that a few of their higher-ups are planning to pay you a visit. They're not happy about what happened to Zeke." Joe's jaw clenched. "How long do we have?" "Maybe a day, maybe less," Carter said. "I'm sending extra patrols your way, but you need to be ready." Joe hung up and immediately relayed the information to Mark. The two men went into action, reviewing their plans and making adjustments. This wasn't just about protecting the house anymore. It was about preparing for a full-scale assault. Emily overheard their conversation from the hallway. Her stomach dropped as the reality of the situation sank in. She wanted to help, but she didn't know how. All she could do was trust her dad and Mark to keep them safe. That night, the tension in the air was almost suffocating. Joe and Mark stationed themselves on the porch, their weapons within arm's reach. Inside, Emily sat by the window, her eyes scanning the dark road for any signs of movement. The hours ticked by, the silence outside broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or distant chirp of crickets. But as midnight approached, a low rumble shattered the stillness. It started faint and distant, like the sound of a far-off storm, but it grew louder with every passing second. Emily's heart raced as she recognized the sound. Motorcycles, dozens of them. "They're here," Joe muttered, rising to his feet. He and Mark exchanged a glance, their expressions grim but determined. "Emily, get to the safe room," Joe called over his shoulder. Emily hesitated, her eyes wide with fear. "Dad, I don't want to leave you." Joe turned to her, his voice firm but gentle. "Emily, please, do this for me." Reluctantly, she nodded and ran to the safe room, locking the door behind her. She pressed her ear to the door, her heart pounding as the roar of motorcycles grew deafening. Outside, the convoy of bikes pulled up in front of the house, their headlights casting long, menacing shadows. At least 20 riders dismounted, their leather jackets and intimidating presence a clear message. They weren't here to negotiate. The leader of the group stepped forward, a towering man with a shaved head and a scar running across his forehead. He carried a shotgun slung over his shoulder and radiated an air of authority. "You must be Joe," the man said, his voice deep and gravelly. "Heard a lot about you. Took down Zeke and his boys, huh? Impressive." Joe didn't flinch. He stood tall, his shotgun resting in his hands but not yet raised. "Who are you?" The man grinned. "Name's Brick. I'm here to clean up the mess you made. And by clean up, I mean bury you." Mark stepped forward, his weapon drawn. "You're outnumbered, Brick. Turn around while you still can." Brick laughed, the sound cold and mocking. "You think this is about numbers? This is about sending a message. Nobody crosses us and gets away with it." Rick raised a hand, signaling his men. They began to fan out, surrounding the house. Joe's mind raced as he calculated their positions, mentally mapping out the best way to defend the property. "You've got one chance to walk away," Joe said, his voice steady. "Take it." Brick's grin faded, replaced by a sneer. "No, Joe. It's you who's out of chances." Suddenly, a series of loud pops echoed in the night as Mark triggered the motion-activated perimeter traps they'd set earlier. Firecrackers and small explosives went off, startling Brick's men and throwing them into disarray. Joe and Mark used the chaos to their advantage. Joe fired a warning shot into the ground, scattering the nearest attackers. Mark picked off another with a well-placed non-lethal round, sending the man crumpling to the ground. But Brick wasn't easily rattled. He barked orders, rallying his men. "Spread out. Surround them." Joe and Mark retreated to the house, using the reinforced walls for cover. From her hiding spot, Emily could hear the chaos unfolding outside. The shouts, the gunfire, the sound of bodies hitting the ground. She clenched her fists, her heart aching with the desire to do something, anything, to help. Outside, the battle raged on. Joe and Mark worked as a seamless team, their years of training and experience giving them an edge over the gang. But the numbers were overwhelming, and even their defenses couldn't hold indefinitely. Brick, meanwhile, stalked closer to the house, his shotgun raised. His men provided cover fire, keeping Joe and Mark pinned down as he approached. "You can't hold out forever, Joe." Brick shouted, "Come out and face me." Joe's eyes narrowed. He glanced at Mark, who nodded. It was time to end this. The air was thick with tension as Joe and Mark exchanged a brief, wordless glance. They both knew what had to be done. The defenses had bought them time, but the gang wasn't backing down. Brick was getting closer, his men pressing harder with each passing second. From her hiding spot in the safe room, Emily clutched the emergency phone, her knuckles white. She could hear the chaos outside, the shouts, the crack of gunfire, and the roar of motorcycles revving in the distance. She whispered a silent prayer, her heart aching with fear for her dad. Joe moved quickly, signaling for Mark to cover him. He slipped out the back of the house, using the shadows as his ally. His movements were quiet and deliberate, a lifetime of SEAL training guiding him. Brick's men were focused on the front, oblivious to the fact that Joe was flanking them. Mark stayed in the house, providing cover fire to keep the gang's attention. He was methodical, targeting the tires of the motorcycles and any exposed attackers, using his non-lethal rounds to disorient and disable them. As Joe crept closer to Brick, he could hear the man barking orders, his deep voice cutting through the chaos. "Push forward. Get inside that house." Joe's grip on his shotgun tightened. He stepped out from the shadows, aiming at Brick's back. "Brick." The gang leader froze, turning slowly to face Joe. His sneer returned, but there was a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "Well, look who decided to join the party." Joe didn't lower his weapon. "Call off your men. This ends now." Brick chuckled, the sound low and menacing. "You don't get it, do you? This doesn't end until I say it does." Joe's finger hovered over the trigger. "You're outnumbered. Half your men are down. Walk away while you still can." Brick's sneer twisted into a snarl. "You think I'm scared of you? You're just one man." Joe's expression didn't waver. "One man's all it takes." Brick growled and raised his shotgun, but Joe was faster. He fired, the blast hitting Brick in the shoulder and sending him spinning to the ground. Brick roared in pain, clutching his wounded arm as Joe stepped closer. "Stay down," Joe warned. But Brick wasn't done. With his good hand, he reached for a knife strapped to his belt. Before he could pull it free, Mark appeared, his weapon trained on Brick. "Don't even think about it," Mark said coldly. Brick froze, his eyes darting between the two men. He was beaten, and he knew it. His men, seeing their leader down, began retreating, abandoning their weapons and scrambling for their motorcycles. The sound of engines roared to life as they sped off into the night, leaving Brick behind. Joe lowered his shotgun, his gaze fixed on Brick. "It's over." Brick glared up at him, blood seeping through his shirt. "You've made a lot of enemies tonight, Matthews. This isn't over." Joe knelt down, his face inches from Brick's. "If anyone else comes after my family, I'll make sure they regret it. Do you understand me?" Brick's sneer faltered, and for the first time Joe saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. He didn't respond, but the silence spoke volumes. As the sirens of approaching police cars echoed in the distance, Joe and Mark stood together, watching as the authorities arrived. Sheriff Carter was the first to step out, his expression a mix of relief and exasperation. "You two sure know how to throw a party," Carter said, surveying the scene. Joe nodded toward Brick, who was being loaded into the back of a patrol car. "He's their leader. He won't be bothering us anymore." Carter sighed. "I'll make sure he doesn't. But Joe, this was too close. You've got to be careful." Joe glanced toward the house, where Emily was standing on the porch, her face pale but her eyes filled with relief. "I'll do whatever it takes to keep her safe." Carter nodded. "I know you will." That night, as the police cleared the scene and the house grew quiet again, Joe sat with Emily on the porch. She leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "Is it really over?" she asked softly. Joe wrapped an arm around her, his voice steady. "It's over. They won't come back." Emily nodded, her eyes closing as exhaustion overtook her. For the first time in days, she felt safe. Mark joined them, a small smile on his face. "You've got one hell of a family, Joe." Joe smiled faintly. "Thanks, Mark, for everything." Mark nodded. "Anytime, brother." The morning after the chaotic showdown with Brick and his gang dawned with a strange stillness. The events of the previous night still hung in the air, but the tranquility of the coastal town seemed to whisper a cautious promise of safety. For the first time in weeks, Emily woke up without the persistent knot of fear in her stomach. In the kitchen, Joe stood at the stove, flipping pancakes while Mark sipped coffee at the table. Emily walked in, her hair still tousled from sleep. She hesitated in the doorway, her eyes scanning the room as if expecting more bad news. Joe looked over his shoulder and smiled. "Morning, kiddo, hungry?" Emily managed a small smile and nodded, taking a seat next to Mark. She glanced out the window, her gaze lingering on the yard where the fight had taken place. "It feels different today," she said softly. Mark chuckled. "That's what happens when you take out the trash." Joe placed a plate of pancakes in front of her, sitting down with his own. "It's not just about last night," he said. "It's about making sure people like that know this isn't the place to bring their trouble." Emily poked at her pancakes with her fork. "Do you really think it's over? What if they send someone else?" Joe reached across the table and placed a hand on hers. "They won't," he said firmly. "Brick was their leader. Without him, the gang will fall apart." Mark nodded. "Your dad's right. They relied on Brick to call the shots. Now that he's out of the picture, they'll scatter. It's over." Emily wanted to believe them, and for the first time she felt like she could. The house was still fortified. The police were keeping an eye on things, and her dad had proven time and again that he could handle anything thrown their way. Maybe, just maybe, they could finally move on. Later that afternoon, Sheriff Carter stopped by the house, his cruiser kicking up a trail of dust as it pulled into the driveway. Joe stepped out onto the porch, his expression neutral as Carter climbed out of the car. "Joe," Carter began, tipping his hat, "I wanted to give you an update." Joe folded his arms. "What's the news?" "Brick's not talking," Carter said. "But his men are. They've confirmed everything we suspected. This gang was part of a larger network, but they're disorganized without Brick. No one's stepping up to take his place." Joe nodded. "Good. That means they'll stay away." Carter hesitated. "That's the hope. But Joe, I need you to promise me something." Joe raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "Take it easy for a while," Carter said. "You've done more than enough. Let us handle the cleanup from here." Joe considered this for a moment before nodding. "You've got my word." For the next few days, life began to return to normal, or as normal as it could be after everything they'd been through. Emily went back to her usual routines, though she still found herself glancing over her shoulder from time to time. Mark decided to stay for a while longer, insisting it was just to make sure, though Joe suspected his old friend was enjoying the quiet coastal life more than he let on. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, Joe and Emily sat on the porch, watching the waves roll in. It was a scene so peaceful that it almost felt surreal. "Do you miss it?" Emily asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Joe glanced at her. "Miss what?" "Your old life," she said. "Being a SEAL, fighting bad guys." Joe chuckled softly. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But I wouldn't trade this for anything." Emily tilted her head. "Even after everything that's happened." Joe nodded. "Especially after everything that's happened. Because it reminded me why I left that life in the first place. So I could be here for you." Emily smiled, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. She had always known her dad was strong, but now she understood just how deep that strength ran. As the days turned into weeks, the memories of the gang's attacks began to fade. The town returned to its usual rhythm, and the Matthews family found a new sense of normalcy. Mark eventually said his goodbyes, leaving with a promise to visit soon. The house remained fortified, but the looming sense of danger had dissipated. One night, as Emily sat in her room sketching in her notebook, she heard a faint knock at her door. "Come in," she called. Joe stepped inside, a small box in his hands. He handed it to her with a smile. "This is for you." Emily opened the box to find a delicate silver bracelet, engraved with the words, "Strength comes from within." She looked up at her dad, her eyes shining. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Joe sat down beside her. "I wanted you to have something to remind you of how strong you are. You've been through a lot, and you've handled it better than most adults would." Emily slipped the bracelet onto her wrist, her heart swelling with emotion. "Thank you, Dad." Joe pulled her into a hug. "You're my world, Emily. I'll always protect you." Weeks turned into months, and the nightmare of Zeke's gang became a distant memory. The Matthews family began to find a new rhythm, one that wasn't shadowed by fear or uncertainty. Emily, though changed by the experience, had grown stronger. Her confidence had blossomed, and she carried herself with a quiet resilience that hadn't been there before. Joe watched his daughter closely, proud of how she had adapted. He had always known Emily was strong, but now she seemed unshakable. Her smile returned more easily, her laughter more genuine. Even the bracelet he had given her seemed to sparkle brighter on her wrist, a constant reminder of the courage she had found within herself. One sunny morning, as Joe mended a fishing net on the dock, Emily joined him, carrying a small picnic basket. She sat down beside him, the breeze tugging at her hair. "Thought you might need a break," she said, handing him the sandwich. Joe grinned. "Thanks, kiddo." As they ate, Emily gazed out at the horizon, her voice thoughtful. "I never really understood why you chose this life, fishing, living in a quiet town. Until now." Joe glanced at her, his brow raised. "And what do you understand now?" Emily smiled softly. "It's not about running away. It's about finding something worth staying for." Joe's chest swelled with pride. "You're a lot smarter than I was at your age." Emily laughed, nudging his arm. "I learned from the best." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the gentle lapping of the waves providing a soothing backdrop. For the first time in what felt like forever, the world seemed to breathe easier. Back at the house, Sheriff Carter stopped by for a casual visit, a rare moment of downtime in his busy schedule. He leaned against his cruiser, sipping a cup of coffee as Joe joined him on the porch. "Things have been quiet," Carter said, a satisfied tone in his voice. "Not a peep from anyone connected to Zeke's gang. Looks like they'd finally gotten the message." Joe nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Good. I've had enough excitement for a lifetime." Carter chuckled. "Can't say I blame you. You deserve some peace, Joe. You've earned it." Joe looked out at the road, his expression thoughtful. "Peace isn't something you earn, Carter. It's something you protect." The sheriff tipped his hat. "Well, if anyone can protect it, it's you." That evening, Joe and Emily sat together on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was a brilliant canvas of orange and pink, the ocean reflecting its colors like molten gold. "Dad," Emily said suddenly, her voice quiet but steady. "Thank you. For everything." Joe turned to her, his brow furrowing. "You don't have to thank me, Emily. You're my daughter. Protecting you isn't something I do for thanks. It's just what I do." Emily nodded, her eyes shimmering with emotion. "I know, but still, thank you." Joe smiled, his heart full. "You've got nothing to thank me for, kiddo. You've been through a lot, and you've come out stronger. I couldn't be prouder of you." Emily leaned her head against his shoulder, the weight of the past months finally lifting. For the first time, she felt truly safe, truly free. The Matthews family's story wasn't one of revenge or violence. It was one of resilience, love, and the unbreakable bond between a father and his daughter. Together, they had faced the storm and emerged stronger, their quiet coastal life restored. As the stars began to twinkle above them, Joe glanced at Emily and thought about how far they had come. Life was unpredictable, full of challenges and dangers, but as long as they had each other, they could face anything. "Come on, kiddo," Joe said, standing and offering her his hand. "Let's head inside. It's time to start looking forward." Emily took his hand, her smile bright against the fading light. "I like the sound of that." And as they walked back into their home, the door closing behind them, it wasn't just the end of a chapter. It was the beginning of a new one filled with hope, strength, and the peace they had fought so hard to protect.